Have you ever wondered why some people seem to carry an invisible weight that slowly destroys them from the inside? Why perfectly healthy individuals suddenly develop mysterious illnesses that doctors can't explain? Carl Jung, one of history's most revolutionary psychologists, discovered something terrifying about repressed emotions. He found that when we push down our deepest feelings, they don't disappear, they transform into physical symptoms, psychological disorders, and life-destroying patterns that can literally kill us. What Jung uncovered was so disturbing that it changed everything we thought we knew about the mind-body connection. He realized that our bodies keep a perfect psychological score, and every emotion we refuse to face eventually demands payment in the form of illness, dysfunction, and suffering. The most shocking part: most people are walking around completely unaware that their physical problems are actually their repressed emotions fighting to be heard. But before we dive into this topic, I want to ask you something. How old are you, and where are you watching us from? Do you find yourself constantly trying to explain yourself, even when others don't understand you? Do you feel like you're carrying emotional burdens that never seem to lift? After subscribing to the channel and liking the video, write your experiences in the comments along with your name. Let's examine your story together. You can also send this video to your loved ones so they can learn these teachings too. Tonight, I'm going to reveal Jung's most dangerous discovery about repressed emotions and exactly how they manifest as physical illness. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your body rebels against emotional suppression, how to recognize when your physical symptoms are actually emotional signals, and most importantly, how to heal yourself by finally facing the feelings you've spent years avoiding. Jung's discovery began with a patient he called Thomas, a successful businessman who came to him with debilitating stomach problems that no doctor could explain. Thomas had been to every specialist, taken every test, tried every treatment. Nothing worked. His pain was real, his suffering was genuine, but medically, he was perfectly healthy. That's when Jung realized he was looking at something revolutionary, a body expressing what the mind refused to acknowledge. During their sessions, Jung discovered that Thomas had spent 15 years suppressing rage about his father's betrayal. When Thomas was young, his father had promised to leave him the family business, then sold it to a competitor without telling him. Thomas never allowed himself to feel angry about this. He told himself it was business, that anger was unprofessional, that successful people don't hold grudges, but his body kept the score. Jung realized that Thomas's stomach pain was located in exactly the area where we feel gut-wrenching betrayal. His digestive system was literally trying to process an emotional experience that his conscious mind had refused to digest. The repressed rage had nowhere to go, so it took up residence in his physical body, creating symptoms that forced Thomas to pay attention to what he'd been ignoring. This was Jung's first major insight: repressed emotions don't vanish when we ignore them. They relocate. They find new ways to express themselves through our physical bodies, our behavior patterns, our relationships, and our life circumstances. The emotion always finds a way to be heard, and the longer we refuse to listen, the louder and more destructive its voice becomes. But here's where Jung's discovery becomes truly terrifying. He found that different repressed emotions create specific types of physical illness. It's not random. There's a precise psychological map that shows exactly how emotional suppression translates into bodily dysfunction. And once you understand this map, you'll never look at illness the same way again. Jung documented that repressed anger typically manifests in the digestive system, liver, and cardiovascular system. People who refuse to acknowledge their rage often develop ulcers, irritable bowel syndrome, high blood pressure, and heart disease. Their bodies are literally inflamed by the fire of unexpressed fury. The anger they won't feel consciously burns them up from the inside. Repressed grief, Jung discovered, attacks the respiratory system and immune function. People who won't allow themselves to mourn losses often develop chronic respiratory problems, frequent infections, and autoimmune disorders. Their bodies can't breathe properly because they're suffocating their own emotional pain. The tears they won't cry internally flood their systems with inflammatory responses. Fear that's been pushed down typically manifests as nervous system disorders, anxiety conditions, and panic attacks. When we refuse to acknowledge what terrifies us, our sympathetic nervous system remains in a constant state of hypervigilance. The body prepares for threats that the conscious mind pretends don't exist, creating chronic stress responses that eventually break down our physical systems. But Jung's most devastating discovery was about repressed shame. He found that deep shame, when pushed into the unconscious, becomes a psychological poison that can manifest as autoimmune diseases, chronic fatigue, and depression, so severe it can be life-threatening. Shame tells us we're fundamentally flawed, and when we repress this feeling, our bodies begin attacking themselves, literally embodying the self-hatred we refuse to consciously experience. Let me tell you about Sarah, a 34-year-old teacher who came to Jung with mysterious joint pain that had been progressively worsening for 3 years. She'd seen rheumatologists, taken anti-inflammatory medications, tried physical therapy. Nothing helped. During Jung's analysis, he discovered that Sarah had been carrying profound shame about her sexuality since adolescence. Sarah had grown up in a strict religious household where any expression of sexual desire was met with severe punishment and shaming. She learned to completely suppress her natural sexual feelings, convincing herself that she was above such base desires, but her body knew better. The repressed sexual energy had nowhere to go, so it began attacking her joints, the very places where movement and flexibility should flow freely. Jung realized that Sarah's body was literally becoming rigid because her psyche had become rigid. The joints that should bend and flow were becoming inflamed and stiff, mirroring the psychological inflexibility she'd imposed on her natural desires. Her autoimmune system was attacking her own tissues because she'd learned to attack her own authentic feelings. This leads us to one of Jung's most important insights about repressed emotions. They don't just create random physical symptoms, they create symptoms that symbolically represent the emotional conflict. The body speaks in metaphors, and illness is often a symbolic expression of psychological wounds that we refuse to consciously acknowledge. Jung found that people with chronic back problems were often carrying burdens they refused to acknowledge. Those with chronic headaches were frequently overthinking situations they were afraid to feel their way through. Individuals with chronic throat problems often had things they needed to say, but were afraid to voice. The body was literally showing them what their psychology was doing. But here's where Jung's insights become even more profound. He discovered that repressed emotions don't just affect the person suppressing them, they create what he called psychological contagion, unconscious emotional patterns that spread to family members, co-workers, and entire social systems. When one person refuses to process their emotions, everyone around them begins carrying the psychological burden. Sarah's repressed shame about sexuality had unconsciously affected her entire family system. Her children had developed anxiety around their own developing sexuality without understanding why. Her husband had become increasingly distant, sensing her internal conflict, but not knowing how to address it. Her mother had developed chronic guilt about how she'd raised Sarah, though neither of them had ever discussed their religious upbringing directly. Jung realized that repressed emotions create invisible psychological fields that influence everyone in proximity. The unprocessed feeling doesn't stay contained within the individual it radiates outward, creating symptoms and conflicts in the broader system. This is why family therapy often reveals that one person's physical illness is connected to another family member's repressed emotional trauma. This brings us to Jung's most revolutionary insight. Healing repressed emotions requires more than just acknowledging them. It requires what he called active imagination, a process of dialoguing with the repressed parts of ourselves, as if they were separate beings with their own intelligence and wisdom. Jung discovered that emotions aren't just feelings to be experienced, they're psychological entities with their own knowledge and purposes. When Thomas finally began dialoguing with his repressed rage about his father's betrayal, something extraordinary happened. The anger revealed itself as a protector that had been trying to prevent Thomas from being betrayed again. It had been creating stomach pain to warn him whenever he was about to trust someone who might hurt him. Once Thomas understood this, he could work with his anger consciously instead of fighting against it unconsciously. The stomach problems began resolving almost immediately, not because the anger disappeared, but because it no longer needed to speak through physical symptoms. Thomas had finally learned to listen to its wisdom consciously. His body could relax because his mind was finally paying attention to the emotional intelligence it had been trying to communicate. Sarah's healing process was more complex because shame is one of the most difficult emotions to face directly. Jung had to help her understand that shame often guards our deepest authenticity. The parts of ourselves we're most ashamed of are frequently the parts that hold our greatest creative and vital energy. Sarah's repressed sexuality wasn't something to be eliminated. It was a source of life force that needed to be integrated consciously. Through active imagination, Sarah began dialoguing with the part of herself that felt sexual desire. She discovered that this aspect of her psyche wasn't the dangerous, destructive force she'd been taught to fear. Instead, it was a creative, passionate energy that wanted to help her feel fully alive. As she developed a conscious relationship with this repressed part, her joint pain began diminishing. But Jung found that the healing process isn't linear. Repressed emotions often surface in waves, bringing up layers of material that have been buried for decades. Sarah experienced periods where her symptoms actually intensified as deeper levels of shame surfaced. Jung called this the healing crisis, the temporary worsening that often occurs when we start processing long-suppressed emotional material. This is crucial to understand because many people abandon their emotional healing work when symptoms temporarily worsen. They think they're doing something wrong when actually they're doing something right. The body often needs to express decades of suppressed emotion before it can find its natural balance again. Jung learned to prepare his patients for these healing crises so they wouldn't panic when old symptoms resurged. Jung also discovered that repressed emotions often carry what he called golden energy, psychological gifts that become available once we stop fighting against difficult feelings. Thomas's anger, once consciously integrated, became a powerful force for setting healthy boundaries and protecting his interests in business. Sarah's sexuality, once accepted, became a source of creative inspiration and deep intimacy in her marriage. This is perhaps Jung's most hopeful insight about repressed emotions. They're not problems to be solved, but energies to be transformed. Every emotion we've pushed away contains wisdom, power, and vitality that we need for psychological wholeness. The goal isn't to get rid of difficult feelings, but to develop conscious relationships with them. But Jung warned that this process requires tremendous courage because repressed emotions often carry memories and experiences that we pushed away for good reasons. Sarah's sexuality had been shamed so severely in childhood that accepting it meant also facing the trauma of that shaming. Thomas's anger connected to not just his father's betrayal, but to a lifetime of feeling powerless and unprotected. Jung found that healing repressed emotions often requires us to feel things we've been avoiding for decades. This is why the process can initially seem to make things worse. We're not just dealing with current symptoms, we're processing years or even decades of suppressed emotional material. But Jung discovered that the body has infinite wisdom for this process if we learn to trust it. The key insight Jung offered is that our bodies never lie. Physical symptoms are always communicating something true about our psychological state, even when our conscious minds are completely confused. Learning to read the body's symbolic language becomes a way of accessing wisdom that our rational minds can't provide. Jung developed specific techniques for translating physical symptoms back into their emotional messages. Headaches often indicated overthinking situations that needed to be felt rather than analyzed. Digestive problems frequently pointed to experiences or relationships that were hard to stomach. Respiratory issues commonly reflected grief or situations that were suffocating our authentic expression. But Jung's approach wasn't just about making these connections intellectually. He insisted that true healing required actually feeling the repressed emotions in the body, not just understanding them mentally. This is where many people get stuck. They can analyze their emotional patterns endlessly without actually allowing themselves to experience the feelings that need to be processed. Thomas had to actually feel his rage about his father's betrayal, not just understand it. Sarah had to actually experience her sexuality in her body, not just accept it as a concept. Jung found that emotions require embodied experience to truly integrate. The mind can understand, but only the body can heal. This leads to Jung's practical methodology for working with repressed emotions and their physical manifestations. First, he taught people to view their symptoms as messengers rather than enemies. Instead of trying to eliminate pain or discomfort, they learned to ask what the symptom was trying to communicate. Second, Jung emphasized the importance of creating safe spaces for emotional expression. Repressed emotions often carry intense energy that needs to be discharged safely. This might involve physical movement, vocal expression, creative arts, or specific breathing techniques that allow the emotion to move through the body naturally. Third, Jung insisted on the importance of integrating emotional insights into daily life. It's not enough to process repressed emotions in therapy. Newfound emotional awareness needs to transform how we live, work, and relate to others. This integration phase is often where lasting healing occurs. But perhaps Jung's most important insight was that healing repressed emotions is ultimately about reclaiming our full humanity. We repress emotions because we've been taught that certain feelings are unacceptable, dangerous, or shameful. But Jung discovered that every emotion serves a purpose and contains intelligence that we need for psychological wholeness. The goal isn't to become emotionless or to express every feeling impulsively. It's to develop emotional sovereignty, the ability to consciously choose how we respond to our feelings rather than being unconsciously controlled by them or unconsciously suppressing them. This emotional sovereignty is what Jung believed was necessary for true psychological health. Jung found that people who successfully integrate their repressed emotions often experience dramatic improvements, not just in physical symptoms, but in their overall life satisfaction. They become more authentic in relationships, more creative in their work, more resilient in facing challenges. The energy that was previously locked up in suppression becomes available for conscious living. But Jung also warned that this process is ongoing. Emotional repression isn't something we heal once and forget about. Modern life constantly presents us with new emotional challenges that we might be tempted to suppress. Developing emotional consciousness is a lifelong practice of staying present with our feelings rather than pushing them away. But Jung's insights about repressed emotions go even deeper than individual healing. He discovered that entire cultures and societies can develop collective patterns of emotional suppression that manifest as widespread illness and social dysfunction. Jung called this phenomenon collective neurosis, when entire groups of people unconsciously agree to suppress certain emotions, creating epidemic levels of physical and psychological illness. In his later work, Jung observed that modern industrial societies had collectively repressed emotions related to grief, mortality, and our connection to nature. He predicted that this collective suppression would eventually manifest as epidemic levels of depression, anxiety, autoimmune diseases, and what we now recognize as environmental illness. Jung saw our disconnection from emotional authenticity as directly linked to our disconnection from the natural world. This brings us to perhaps Jung's most prescient insight about repressed emotions in the modern era. He understood that technological advancement without emotional development would create unprecedented levels of psychological suffering. Jung predicted that as societies became more mechanized and rational, people would lose touch with their emotional intelligence, leading to a crisis of meaning and widespread physical illness. Jung's solution wasn't to reject technology or return to primitive living. Instead, he advocated for what he called conscious evolution, the intentional development of emotional intelligence alongside technological advancement. He believed that future human survival would depend on our ability to integrate our emotional wisdom with our rational capabilities. This is why Jung's work on repressed emotions feels so relevant today. We're living in the world, he predicted, a technologically advanced society with epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, autoimmune diseases, and mysterious chronic illnesses that often have no clear medical cause. Jung would say we're experiencing the collective consequences of emotional suppression on a massive scale. But here's where Jung's vision becomes hopeful. rather than apocalyptic. He believed that individual emotional healing could create ripple effects that transform entire communities and eventually entire cultures. When one person learns to consciously process their emotions rather than suppressing them, they become a healing influence on everyone around them. Their emotional authenticity gives others permission to access their own repressed feelings. Jung documented this phenomenon in his own practice. As patients like Thomas and Sarah learned to integrate their repressed emotions, their family members often began spontaneously healing from their own physical and psychological symptoms. The emotional courage of one person created a field of permission that allowed others to face their own suppressed feelings. This is why Jung believed that individual emotional work was actually a form of social activism. By healing our own repressed emotions, we're not just improving our personal health, we're contributing to the healing of our collective emotional intelligence. We're modeling for others that it's safe to feel deeply and authentically. Jung found that people who successfully integrate their repressed emotions often become natural healers and teachers, not because they're trying to help others, but because their emotional authenticity naturally inspires others to explore their own emotional depths. Their presence communicates that it's possible to feel difficult emotions without being destroyed by them. This leads to Jung's practical guidance for creating what he called emotional sanctuaries, environments where people can safely explore and express their repressed feelings. Jung believed that healing spaces needed to honor both the rational mind and the emotional body, providing structure and safety, while allowing for authentic emotional expression. In Jung's vision, these emotional sanctuaries could exist in therapy offices, healing centers, spiritual communities, artistic spaces, or even family homes, where emotional authenticity is welcomed and supported. The key elements are safety, acceptance, and the understanding that emotions are intelligent communications rather than problems to be solved. Jung also emphasized the importance of creating personal daily practices for staying connected to our emotional intelligence. This might include journaling about feelings, spending time in nature, engaging in creative expression, or simply taking moments throughout the day to check in with our bodies and notice what emotions might be present. But Jung warned against making emotional work into another form of self-improvement or spiritual achievement. He found that people could actually repress their emotions in the name of emotional healing, creating new layers of suppression disguised as spiritual practice. The goal isn't to become emotionally perfect, but to develop an honest, ongoing relationship with our feeling states. Jung's ultimate insight was that repressed emotions aren't obstacles to overcome but doorways to reclaim. Every feeling we've pushed away contains not just pain but also power, wisdom and vitality that we need for full psychological wholeness. The depression that seems so destructive might contain profound sensitivity that the world desperately needs. The anxiety that feels so limiting might hold intuitive wisdom about real dangers that need attention. As we truly conclude this exploration of Jung's revolutionary insights about repressed emotions and physical illness, remember that your healing journey is not just personal, it's contributing to the collective healing of human emotional intelligence. Every emotion you choose to feel rather than suppress, every physical symptom you approach with curiosity rather than resistance, every moment you choose authenticity over emotional numbness is an act of service to the broader human family. Jung's revolutionary discovery was that we don't have to choose between emotional wellness and physical health. They're intimately connected. By learning to consciously relate to our emotions, we can often resolve physical symptoms that have puzzled doctors for years. By honoring the intelligence of our feelings, we reclaim the vitality that emotional suppression steals from us. The wisdom Jung offers isn't just about healing current symptoms, it's about preventing future illness by developing healthy relationships with our emotional lives. When we stop fighting against our feelings and start learning from them, our bodies can return to their natural state of health and vitality. Your body is waiting for you to listen to what it's been trying to tell you through those symptoms, those tensions, those mysterious aches and illnesses. Your repressed emotions are waiting to share their wisdom and transform their pain into power. The question Jung would ask is not whether you're strong enough to feel what you've been avoiding, but whether you're brave enough to reclaim the full spectrum of your humanity. If this exploration of Jung's discoveries resonates with you, if you want to continue diving into the depths of human psychology and healing with us, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share your experiences in the comments. Have you noticed connections between your emotions and physical symptoms? Understanding these psychological dynamics is the first step toward reclaiming your full health and authentic power.